Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk a little bit about the scales I like to use and also my kind of general thought process and application of scales, how I like to use them and how I think about them. It's a question I often get asked on social media, on the little videos I put on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook and YouTube, particularly the shorter videos where it's kind of a short kind of phrase or lick. I'm often asked in the comments, what scale am I using or what scales do I use? And it's kind of a difficult question to answer, especially in just a reply in a Instagram caption. So I thought I'd make this video just to go into a bit more in-depth description of my use of scales. Now I will give a list of the kind of popular scales and scales I like to use a bit later on in the video, but I'd like to start by kind of explaining my thought process behind using scales, because I think that's probably more important than the actual list of scales, because you can find a list of scales on plenty of websites online, but knowing how to apply them and how to think about them is a different thing really. So one of the reasons why it can be difficult to explain this, especially in a short, response on social media on a comment, is because scales are not my primary thought process when I'm playing. When I'm actually playing and also composing and things, I'm generally thinking in chords and chord movements. Now I will go into a bit more depth about this later on in the video, but I just wanted to mention that I'm not generally, although I do use scales, my thought process is not based around scales, and so I think that can be one of the reasons why it's difficult for me to explain what scales I use, because when I'm actually playing, I'm thinking more about chords and chord tones and how they relate to the chords in that I'm playing over, the chord sequences I'm playing over, and kind of scales kind of slot into that way of thinking. Now I think of scales as essentially being the same thing as chords, from a practical point of view, that is. Of course you can go into lots of different scale theory, you can make chord structures out of scales and all that kind of thing. But when I'm just talking about kind of improvising and playing over tunes and stuff like that, I kind of think of scales and chords as being essentially the same thing. In fact, there's a very grey area where they kind of, when arpeggios kind of become scales. If you think of a chord, it's got 3 notes, 4 notes, 5 notes, maybe more, but usually 3 upwards. Probably average 4 or 5 notes in chords within kind of jazz music at least. And you think about scales, usually most scales are 7 notes, but some are more, some are less. You've got, for example, the pentatonic scale, which is, they call a scale, but really is more of an arpeggio really. So this is where the grey area is between what's a scale and what is not a scale, So to me, I just kind of group them as one thing. They're just groups of notes that sound a certain way, and they have a certain flavour, and you can arpeggiate them. You can play notes of them together, which would be usually as chords, but you can also select notes from scales to create chords that are slightly unusual, maybe depending on the scale you're in. So to me, they're all the same thing. It's not like here are arpeggios and here are scales. To me, they're in the same bag. So with that in mind, I'd like to just give you a little analogy about chords and scales and arpeggios, which are this one thing. My dad's a painter and my mum was a painter as well, and I often draw parallels between music and art. And I think of chords, scales, groups of notes as being colours, the equivalent of colours in a painting. And I think of the details in a painting, the lines and that kind of thing, that is rhythm. And so if you take a chord and you play a melody with that chord or a line with that chord, that's like taking a colour and creating some kind of pattern or detail or picture or sketch or whatever, you know. So you could take a G major chord, that might be, say, a green or something, and if you play a riff on a G major chord, that might be a bird in green paint or something like that. And that's kind of how I visualize. I don't have specific colors for specific chords, but that's just kind of how I kind of think of chords. And so you get a painting that's very colorful. That's like having a chord sequence or a song with lots of different chord changes and cadences. You get an image that's black and white. That's like having just a couple of chords. And this is kind of how I picture it. And then you also get different shades of chords. So you might have a G major 7, that might be a slightly different shade of green. And so this is kind of how I picture it. And the kind of weird coincidence with all of this is in colour you have 3 primary colours. You have red, yellow and blue. And those are the 3 colours by which all other colours are derived by mixing. And in music you have 3 chord qualities, at least in Western harmony music: major, minor and dominant. And pretty much, there might be a few exceptions, but pretty much all chords are derived from these. You've got dominant, you've got altered dominant, you've got augmented, you've got minor, you've got minor 7 flat 5, major, you might have major 7, major 9, major 7 sharp 11, etc. But they all fall within these 3 primary chords or primary colours. That's kind of a weird coincidence, but it's another thing that helps me draw those kind of parallels. So now I'll talk a little bit about how I think about music when I'm playing and how I kind of visualize it. I think of all notes in terms of their relationship to the chord and chord sequence that I'm on at the time. So if we've got a 2-5-1 in, say, D major, you've got an E minor 7 to an A7 of some type to a D major of some type. And so when we're on the E minor, all of the chromatic notes are available to be used, but they all have slightly different roles and different sounds, obviously, but they can be used in different ways. The strong notes, these are the ones that I kind of picture in the foreground. These are the 1s, 3s, 5s, 7s, 9s, these kind of chord tones. These are strong, they are heavily rooted within the sound of the chord. You can really rest on them and create melodies with them. And then some of the other notes, like like the flat 5, the major 3rd over a minor chord, for example. That's a note that you generally not going to rest on much, but it can be used in a passing context or in an approach context. So all notes are available, every single note. But I kind of see them in a kind of a picture where some are in the distance and some are in the foreground. And the foreground ones are the strongest notes, the roots, the 5s and the 3s, and then as you go into the other notes and the chromatic notes, they kind of become further away, and so that further away in kind of strength to the chordal center. So the other way I'm picturing notes, and this kind of goes in tandem with in terms of their relationship to the chords, this is going on alongside that. I'm thinking of the notes in terms of their relationship to the chord sequence or cadence that I'm playing at the time. So for example, if you're on an E minor, the 1 of E minor is the 5 of A and it's the 9 of D. And for example, the 5 of E minor is the 9 of A7 and it's the 6th of D. And this goes for the kind of the in-between notes as well. The E flat, which is the major 7 of a E minor, is the flat 5 of the A, and it's a flat 9 of the D. It's not a note you probably would rest on the D major, but it's it can be used in a kind of passing context or just to create tension in general. But that's kind of how I think about it. So I'm thinking about the notes in terms of the chord I'm on and in terms of the sequence. Now this can be, if it's like a long sequence with lots of key changes, very often this is kind of compartmentalized into like, you know, a 2-5-1 in this key, or a 1-4-3-6 in this key, and it's kind of, you kind of group things into sequences you're familiar with. But if it's like, for example, you know, a 12 bar where it's all rooted in one key, very often all the notes I kind of think in terms of their chord that they're on and the home key as well, and it kind of that's how I kind of picture it in my head. So perhaps I'll do another video that concentrates more about how I kind of learnt to think in this way. But I should mention that when I'm actually playing, it's become kind of a subconscious thing. It's not something I'm actively calculating when I'm playing. Now, obviously, with when I encounter new chord sequences that I'm unfamiliar with, I have to think a bit sometimes, you know, to get my head around the chord sequences. But generally, when I'm playing and I'm kind of improvising over sequences I'm comfortable with, it's become a subconscious thing. It's almost like when you change gear on a car. When you first learn to drive, you know, you have to take your foot off the accelerator, put your foot on the clutch, change the gear, pull the clutch while putting the accelerator back on, all while driving down a road, you know. But eventually, once you're an experienced driver, it just happens without thinking, and you can be chatting to someone and changing gear and not even thinking about it. And so that's kind of what happens with this kind of way of thinking. Eventually it just becomes ingrained, and you don't have to calculate it. Now I thought I'd give you a little example to demonstrate why I kind of think like this, as opposed to thinking more scalically. Because I know some musicians do think more scalically than I do, and everybody's got their own approach to music, and I think it's great to have different approaches to music. I think that's what makes everybody sound different and play different. But for the way I like to play and the way I'm trying to sound, this kind of approach makes most sense to me. I'm going to play a little line here over a D minor, and then I'll explain to you, you know, my thought process behind it. So something like this maybe. So that was kind of a lick over a D minor, a line. Now, if I was to break that down and analyse that, if I was coming at it from a scalic point of view, you could say, you know, the first few notes were from D melodic minor, and then this note here was from maybe Dorian, and this was Dorian, and this note here is in Aeolian or harmonic minor, and this is back into Dorian. And you could go through the whole lick in terms of its scalic values, the note values within the scale. But I think it's much easier just to think of D minor. And so I'm not thinking this is a scale. I'm thinking this is major 7, 1, 2, 3, flat 3 in the case of D minor, 4, 5, flat 7, 5, sharp 5 or flat 13, 13, etc., etc. And that's how I'm thinking about it, and that makes a lot more sense to me than having to change scales and even just thinking about, oh, I'm in one scale but I've added chromatic notes. To me, that's I prefer a more open minded approach than saying I'm using all Dorian, but I've used a couple of extra notes. I'd rather just think, this is all just D minor. So I thought I'd mention just a little bit about some thoughts I had about the whole kind of guitar scale thing. Now, I could be wrong, but I get the impression it's a very guitar-y kind of thing to be always thinking about different scales and stuff. And I think it comes from how we learn guitar. Now, most of us, when we first learn guitar, you learn it in shapes. You learn chord shapes, and you see diagrams, and you put your fingers here. And we don't know what those notes are. We don't know how they relate to each other. We don't know anything about it other than it's just a shape that you put on your fingerboard, and it sounds, there's A, there's D, you know. And then when we start looking into lead guitar, we do the same thing. We find, say, a pentatonic scale. This is my first scale was a pentatonic scale. You can you learn where your kind of fingers go, you know. Then you might learn a few licks that fit within the scales, perhaps some patterns. And you learn that you can bend a few of the notes. Maybe add the little blues scale note there. And it's kind of miraculous that you can do so much with so little. You can literally, you know, become a professional guitar player with just knowing a handful of shapes. You can take the minor pentatonic, you can maybe add one note and turn that into a blues scale. You might learn the major pentatonic, but you can just basically take the same shape and move it down 3 frets. You might learn a major scale and perhaps like Dorian or Aeolian or something like that, but you need relatively little theoretical knowledge to really get by and make some great music, especially if you've got a good ear for the way things sound. You can really do a lot with a small set of tools. And while I think it's absolutely fine to play music with you know, just knowing a few shapes and just using your ear, you can really make great music doing that. You don't have to get deep into kind of theory and stuff to make great music. But I think what happens, at least what happened to me, is you do this. That's kind of how I played through my teens. You know, didn't know a lot about theory. I just knew some kind of shapes and things. But when you start getting into jazz, you think maybe the same thing applies. There's just kind of a scale or a couple of scales you can just learn, and then suddenly that just opens the door to jazz music. But unfortunately, it doesn't work really like that, and that's where I think sometimes this kind of pentatonic guitar playing approach can be a bit misleading in some ways, because even in rock music and pop music and blues guitar playing, if you really analyse and transcribe the great players, you know, like Jimmy Page, Peter Green, B.B. King, you know, Angus Young, these guys aren't just playing in one box. They're not just playing one scale over everything. They're playing over the chords that are happening underneath, and they outline chord tones in their playing. So it can be a little misleading in that way, especially when you start learning jazz, because with jazz music, if you're going down the kind of jazz standards kind of route, these compositions have more complex chord structures. There are more kind of cadences, there are more key changes and all this kind of thing. And it's much harder to find a kind of one-size-fits-all scale that will just get you through everything. So you really kind of have to start digging a bit deeper into chord knowledge and theory in order to understand how the scales work over the chords that you're on, and how the approach notes work and all this kind of thing. So that's just my kind of basic kind of thoughts on the kind of guitar kind of approach to learning, you know, and how it can kind of be a bit misleading in some ways. However, having said all of that, I do use scales, and I think most musicians will use scales, but I think it's more about how you think about them. That for me, the way I play, at least the way I want to sound, that's the crucial part. So I am going to give you a list now of common scales that I like to use, and the kind of the tool bag, if you will, of scales that can come in handy. But I should just mention, just before I give you the list, that with scales, it's good to think about them in terms of their note values rather than shapes. So, for example, you know, a major scale is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. A Dorian scale is 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7 root. So I kind of I think that's a better way of visualizing scales rather than picturing boxes on the fingerboard. Think of them in terms of their note values, because they're much more useful if you think of them in this way. Okay, so the list of scales. Now, I apologise if all you wanted was a list of scales at the start of the video and you didn't want all that rambling, but I think knowing how to use scales is as important as knowing the scales themselves. Learning a list of scales, a big list of scales, is not going to be a lot of use if you don't know how you can apply them. And also I should mention that the way I think about these, not necessarily the way everybody else does. So you kind of got to find your own way. Some people think more scalically and make it work. So find out the way you want to play, and you know, and pick the method that works best for you. So as I said earlier, I think of music in 3 primary colours, 3 primary chords: major, minor, and dominant. And underneath these headings, you have kind of subcategories because there are different types of major chords. Not all major chords are treated the same. Sometimes they might be 1 chords, they might be a 4 chord, they might be, you know, a 6 chord in a minor key, and they could be a relative major of a minor chord in a minor key. Likewise, minor chords can be 1 chords in a minor key, they can be 2 chords, they can be 4 minor chords, they could be 6 chords, 3 chords, etc., etc. Dominant chords, likewise, there are lots of variations with alterations, and different alterations will work different in different situations better than others. So it's not like I apply all of these scales to all major chords. It's a little more complex than that. So the major category, you've obviously got the major scale, which is often referred to as Ionian. Then you've got Lydian, which is the 4th mode of the major scale, and it's the same as a major scale but with a raised 4th. Then you've got the pentatonic major, and there are some other pentatonic scales that work over major chords, not just the main ones that we learn. There are lots of different pentatonic scales you can find out there. One scale I've kind of toyed with a little bit is the Lydian augmented scale, which is the 3rd mode of the melodic minor, and this one can sound kind of a little out there sometimes. It doesn't always sound right, you know, you can't use it in every situation, but sometimes it can sound nice. It's got a raised 4 and a raised 5, so it's kind of slightly you know, it sounds a little different. Then of course I've written chromatic scale here, but you can use chromatic scales, you know, chromatic stuff over everything. Okay, so minor, you've got 4 big ones with the minor. You've got the harmonic minor, melodic minor, and then you've got Aeolian and Dorian. Aeolian and Dorian are modes of the major scale. Dorian's 2nd mode, Aeolian is the 6th. And the harmonic and the melodic, those 4 are probably the most commonly used. There are others, you've got Phrygian of course, but those 4 are probably the most useful on a practical level. Then you've got the pentatonic scale, the blues scale, and you can do things with the diminished scale over a minor chord. Obviously it starts to sound a bit more jazzy, but the whole half scale over a minor chord works. And there are ways of using the whole tone over a minor chord as well, but you don't include the root in the chord a bit. Again, that can sound kind of you know, a bit more jazzy and a bit more out there. Then we've got dominant scales. the big one is the mixed Lydian mode. It's fifth mode of the major scale, and that is your basic dominant sounding scale. And then other options, we start to alter notes and raise and flatten the fifth and the ninth. You end up with a Lydian dominant, which is the fourth mode of the melodic minor, the altered scale, which is the seventh mode of the melodic minor. I use both of those quite a bit. Diminished scale is great over dominant, usually a half whole diminished scale. Whole tone scale is great as well. And then you've got some pentatonics you can use over dominant chords. You can even use the major pentatonic over a dominant chord, and it kind of, you end up with it's like a 6, but a 6 is like a 13. So you can it can work in some instances. And another thing you can do with dominant chords is, depending on the instance, it won't always sound right, but you can use sometimes like Dorian and the blues scale and some of the minor options, because the minor third of a minor scale is the sharp 9 of a dominant scale. So they can sound right, especially like, say for example in a blues, where it's like you're in blues in B flat and you're on that one chord. You could use like a minor pentatonic scale over that, for example. So there are options like that. So those are the scales I tend to use most often. But there are lots of other scales that I haven't mentioned here. I didn't mention Locrian, there's Phrygian, you've got the bebop scales. There are lots of other pentatonic scales other than the kind of main ones that we learn. You've got Messiaen's modes of limited transposition, and like I said earlier on, I think of chords and scales as being the same thing really. So if there are many kind of extended arpeggios that could kind of work as a scale as well, like 5-note arpeggios that kind of fall under the pentatonic category, but they're arpeggios, but they're kind of scales as well. So there are lots of different scales and arpeggios that you can experiment with and have a bit of fun with. And I recommend learning as many as you can, looking at as many of them as you can, and eventually you'll find the ones that you like the most and the ones that fit your playing and maybe fit the style of music you're playing. But don't be scared of scales. I think a lot of people can be intimidated by them. They're there to be used, and experimented with. So get stuck in, and you can look them all up on the internet and find out what the note values of the scales, and then you can find the best positions that work for you, and see if you like them or not. Another thing I should mention that I haven't so far is that you can use scales in creative ways, just in the same way that you might do chord substitutions. So because I think of scales and chords as kind of being the same thing really, when you might do a chord substitution, you could try the same thing but with scales, and you can often find yourself in some kind of some unusual sounding situations doing this, and it can be good. Sometimes it doesn't work, but that's one cool thing that you can do with scales. So you don't have to necessarily play them as only their intended kind of root purpose. I mean, you can even use scales that don't have the root note in them, like how you might use a whole tone scale over a minor chord by using it a semitone below. That's one way that you can use a whole tone scale. So I'm using an A flat whole tone scale over an A minor, and there are some common notes. There's the minor third, but then there's a flat 9 and a major 7, so it can kind of sound in but out at the same time. So you can do lots of these interesting things with scales, and they are there to be experimented with, and there are no rules really. It's just, if you like the sound of it, do it. That's what I think anyway. So hopefully some of that was of interest to you and maybe some use. Like I said before, thinking my kind of thought process is not primarily about the scales really, but in my playing, I might descend a scale or ascend a scale or use a scale for a sound, but generally I'm thinking more in terms of chords and chord tones. I think it's important to kind of reiterate that simply learning scale, big shapes up and down the fingerboards, that is not the best way to learn music, in my opinion. Being aware of and knowing about the scales is great and very useful, but I think if you really want to learn to play like Charlie Parker, then transcribe Charlie Parker and learn what he did, because simply learning like the common scales of jazz won't make you sound like Charlie Parker or any other player, you know. So I think the best way to learn is to go to music and learn music and use kind of scales and stuff and arpeggios as a kind of a tool to aid you in that process. But anyway, it's all really interesting subject. It's something I've always been very interested in. So feel free to ask me any questions anytime. Drop me some comments below if I've missed something, or hopefully I've been clear. But if there's anything you're unsure about, I always do my best to get back to you. And yeah, see you next time.